Gathering voices, building worlds. The Ampliverse.
And welcome to another edition of the Autistic Delicatessen with me, Shalise, and Melissa. Unfortunately, Nico couldn't be here on this episode, but again, check out his stuff on Food on the Spectrum on Instagram and on other social media platforms. Today's guest is Will Schanbacher, back on the show. He's an associate professor of religious studies at the University of South Florida in Tampa. And he has a current book out entitled Food Insecurity, a Reference Handbook. So, Will, welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Can you give us kind of like a short history about what food insecurity is here in this country and how it connects to like different things?
Sure. And that's the difficult thing. We, my co-author Whitney Fung and I attempted to do that in the first chapter of this book. So it's the background and history chapter. And maybe I'll back up for a second before answering that question directly, because this really, in a certain way, framed our entire decision to write this book in the first place. Both Whitney and I were part of this organization that I'm a director of at USF called the USF Urban Food Sovereignty Initiative. And that is a initiative that is transdisciplinary, multidisciplinary. We have over 15 faculty members from different research backgrounds, everything from my department, which is religious studies, to sociology, to as diverse as the College of Public Health, to the Muma College of Business, and really kind of expanding. And the reason that initiative is important to mention is it's founded on the food sovereignty idea that problems like food insecurity are so complex. We're never going to find answers to them unless we bring our collective minds together from our different areas of expertise to tackle what we refer to, and many scholars refer to, as a wicked problem with respect to food insecurity. When people talk about this as a wicked problem, they mean there is no simple solution to it. And quite often, in some cases, there's just no good solution to it, right? The answers or the policies or the programs that we implement are inevitably entail harming others in the process. So recognizing this is just a colossal problem in the first place, the Food Sovereignty Initiative at USF engages to kind of attempt to tackle this, but from a diversity of perspectives. And so as such, food sovereignty historically has been a counter narrative or a counter perspective that has presented sort of issues in a different light or a different perspective than our traditional ways of looking at food insecurity. And specifically, food sovereignty is concerned with the root causes of food insecurity rather than kind of looking at solutions to temporary food insecurity problems, which are very important. We need that. We need sort of emergency systems that provide food for people on a day-to-day basis. If we're really going to solve this problem on a long-term level, we need to have a better understanding of how it all came to be. And so when I was first approached to write this book, naturally, as the title indicates, Food Insecurity Reference Handbook, my first inclination was, thank you so much for the offer, but no, thank you. And then the more I thought about it and the more that I continue to work in the community, I recognized that food sovereignty is a concept that is often not understood or even used in regular community conversations. In my previous research, in my first two books, when I looked at food sovereignty, it was largely couched in where it was born, which is South America, Central America. So kind of far away from our, US contexts. And so it really kind of hit me quite literally in the face when I recognized that people kind of looked at me and said, I have no idea what you're talking about when you say this term food sovereignty. And as I continue to have these conversations, I recognize that maybe there is a greater need before we have this topic of food sovereignty being addressed is to actually see if people are even using it. And instead, food insecurity becomes a more common term. And so that really sort of made me think, okay, perhaps I should take on this project and talk about food insecurity, right? Because it's the more common term, but do it from a food sovereignty perspective. And so that's what's really kind of revolutionary or unique about this project is it's about food insecurity, but we're looking at it from a new way. How do we look at food insecurity from the perspective of food sovereignty? And so that roundabout description leads to how we frame the question in the first place. And this leads to your question about the short history of food insecurity. And what Whitney and I do in this book is we start from the very beginning. And we focus specifically here on what we now call the United States and how food insecurity was conceptualized from the very beginning. And obviously, this term wasn't measured or wasn't, used all the way up until recently. So we have to kind of decide, okay, well, what do we mean by food insecurity? And one of the unique things that we really started off with is thinking back to some of our earliest, I would be curious to know if you all had this experience, some of our earliest exposure to conversations or narratives during the early years of this country, the colonial period. When you heard about people talking about food and food insecurity indirectly, what were those stories that we read in our textbooks and things like that? For me, one of the first things that I remember is this sort of European kind of colonial story of the winter starving or the starving time during those first winters. So that word itself kind of indicates, oh, wait a second, this might be an example of food insecurity. They're talking about starving, right? But when we look closely at that, we ask ourselves, well, who's starving? It's these Europeans who are, colonizing or, settling in these new lands who are starving. We know that indigenous Native American populations weren't starving, right? And so from the very beginning, you see how the narrative has automatically focused on Europeans, white Europeans in particular, and their experience of food insecurity or hunger, right? Whereas if we were to look at the beginning of this story from the side of indigenous Native Americans, right, it would have perhaps started with a time of food abundance, right? And if we did have food abundance, if we did not have food insecurity from the side of indigenous peoples, we might then ask the question, okay, well, what was it about their systems that made them food secure? And then we start to dive into all of the interesting ways in which Native Americans, and there's a diverse ways in which, they obtain food, whether it's through hunter and gathering processes, traditional sort of what we might consider farming, nomadic lifestyles, all of these different ways in which Native Americans, indigenous people secured food and generated their own food insecurity. So once we start to tell the story from that perspective, we start to see that food insecurity as we understand it today perhaps is a misnomer in some ways, right? And it definitely misses the very origins of how this came to be. And so maybe we can talk about this in a little more detail, but what I want to point out in that early history is as we kind of move through the book, that first chapter on the background and history, we start to using now that kind of reverse narrative of, well, who is saying that they're food insecure? We see that time and again throughout history, right, the American history in particular, that the people who are determining or defining what we mean by food insecurity are the people who are in power, and the people who are food insecure, the ones who don't have access to food, the ones who are not participating in the decision-making processes are the populations that are generally food insecure. And as we note, as the data shows, all the way up to today, that is communities of color. BIPOC communities, indigenous, Black, Latino, Latina communities as the most food insecure, and the white communities are not.
That's kind of interesting, Will, and really hearing about here in America about the different things. Because when you were on last with me and Oni, we talked about kind of like how there's different areas and even inner city areas to where there's the poverty population and how their access to food is not as much the same as people like in suburban communities around the country or something, and we talked about food deserts and food swamps.
Yeah, so I know food deserts, they have a tendency to be not only in poor urban areas because it's not just rural areas, but it's also, urban areas as well where a lot of times they're not having the best access to nutritious food. And so they have a lot of like bodegas and, smaller scale stores that provide things like processed food, junk food, things like that. And so that also is what I understand to be a food desert.
Well, the only thing, if we wanted to take the conversation in this direction, Shalise is exactly right. We do have a tendency, well, we see them in both urban and rural areas, but I think that this conversation about understanding why we have food deserts in urban areas is particularly interesting. And that, speaking back to our kind of that original conversation about the history of food insecurity itself, requires a deeper dive into how we came to be. And so one of the things, just to give you an example, in our book, dating back to sort of even the civil rights movement, for example, and even before then, as we were moving into the era of desegregation and society being integrated a little bit more, we see some of these things that we might not necessarily associate with food, namely redlining, for example, right? This was something that occurred in the housing sector to limit African Americans' ability to purchase homes, but also to access to education and these types of things. And there's a whole history behind that too that we don't associate with food insecurity directly, but there is a direct link there. And the fact that today, when we look at those food deserts, as Shalise mentions, the neighborhoods that those food deserts are in, we can literally overlay those maps of cities across the country and look at those redlining areas. And there's just this terribly, blatant illustration of how those redlined areas also happen to be the neighborhoods and the food deserts that we have today. So it's not like this is something that just popped up. We can trace this all the way back to the 50s, 60s, and 70s here in the United States. What was, originally redlined is also the areas that are less food secure and the areas that turn out to be food deserts.
And also, food deserts are created by geology and geography as well, which is something a lot of people don't understand. Like, so for instance, I this goes off a project I did on my master's thesis. I was studying the Arctic communities, northern Canada and the Arctic and Greenland, and those people, they suffer from food deserts because of the fact that the soil there, like just the land itself, is not really habitable to growing food, especially nutritious vegetables and fruits. And so they have to depend on everything being flown in and imported, which drives up the cost of that food. And it makes it so they're unable to afford that food that's flown in. And so like that in and of itself, like the land itself, the way that geography works kind of creates a food desert in and of itself, which is something that a lot of people tend to miss when they think about this too.
Yeah, I think I have so many ideas about this topic, because you can go in so many directions. But I think my most basic thought, and it's something that I personally think about all the time, just because I'm a very outdoorsy person. Like I love, being out in the woods and being out in nature, and I'm always thinking about, like obviously we're living in a city where, it's very populated here, but I'm like, how neat would it be just to walk down the street and be able to pick a snack off of a tree, like have these, especially living in Florida. I have a lot of produce growing around my property. But I got into a conversation with one of my friends a few weeks ago, specifically about this. And we were like, even though it's something small and it would obviously not solve a ton of problems, but just to be able to have, like, we live in a climate where we're fortunate that things flourish here and things grow, and we have, like fruit trees and produce and everything that we can grow here. And I was just like, it mystifies me as to why it's not more accessible. And everyone's like, well, there's, and I don't know, this is, what we were chatting about, but they were like, well, it's not, it would take away from the ability to put a dollar sign on that apple or put a dollar sign on that mango, or whatever. So we don't see it as much because it's a little more controlled than we would want it to be, because, but to me, I'm like, well, why wouldn't we take advantage of that? If everyone could have access to fresh food right off of the tree or right off of whatever, it would at least be something, So I don't know. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's just very interesting to me. It's very interesting. Uh, and then the other thing that I was thinking, I think the emphasis on the types of food that we're making accessible to, the emphasis on the nutritious foods and things like that. Like there's a lot of, I know that especially here, like we have things in our food that's outlawed in other countries. So like the food that we do have, is it even considered something, that we would want to distribute because it's not necessarily healthy, nutritious food? And then I think my last thought is just that I obviously I'm not a scientist, I'm not an engineer, I don't know what goes into these things, but I always have this thought in the back of my head that, you know, we have this huge wave of technology and all these things, and it seems like so much of that is to keep us moving at a fast pace. Um, like there's not a lot of, in my opinion, like we could be
Yeah.
applying so much of that to more functional things, such as making sure that we're getting healthy, nutritious foods out to the people that need them. And I, in my mind, I'm just like, where is that gap? Like, where are we, like, why do we need, self-driving cars when we have people who are lacking a basic need, which is food? Why would we not put more emphasis on that? That's kind of where I'm at.
And just to like go off of what Melissa was saying right here, hopefully, like, is that like is more of, we talked in the past, Will, about community gardens and how like in urban areas there's community gardens, but then I also mentioned about like businesses being able to be of access there, or like local grocery stores in like the Black or Latino communities and all that stuff, to where like they're not just access to just the food that's available and all that stuff. It's like there's actual grocery stores to that population or something like that, or restaurants that are into that population too as well. So, so for me, it's not just only about the community gardens and the farmers markets, which is good, that's fine, but it's also about actual businesses, because why can't Whole Foods do their business out in the urban areas and not just in the suburban areas and all that stuff? Because it kind of like seems like in some ways counterproductive to people that actually need that and have affordable prices over there. So that's just what I see on that.
That's all great points too. And if I may, I'll maybe adjust a couple of these things back to one of Melissa's comments that I think really touches upon another core concept of food sovereignty, and moving into also an idea of food justice. Of, if we recognize, as I was talking about before, that the reason that the food system has come to be the way that it is today, the reason that we have communities of color facing higher rates of food insecurity, is not something that's just happenstance. It happened because of deliberate forces and deliberate decisions dating back to the colonial era and throughout policies, for the last several hundred years. Now, with that said, food sovereignty says, when we talk about these things like food, basic human needs, right? Plants that are growing food that we can go walk up to and pick, right? Vegetables that are growing from the ground. These are what many, scholars and activists will call the commons. These are something that can't be owned. They can't be privatized. They're here for all of us, just like the air, the water, and the land from which our food comes from. And so why can't we have, these forests that are, abundant with fruits and veggies and things like that? And in fact, people since the 1970s, I talk about this just briefly in the book. There's a kind of a famous movement, never really took a ton of momentum, but it still happens today, called guerrilla gardening. And this is just the idea that people say, look, just because this piece of land is, quote, owned by the government or something like that, doesn't mean that, if it's just sitting there vacant, why can't I just grow a tree on it? I'm not harming anybody. If anything, I'm improving the soil. And so many people throughout, American history, or at least since the 1970s, have done this kind of thing. And that's not common just to the United States. We have, when we look globally, for example, movements down in Brazil, like the Movimento Sem Terra, which is the landless workers movement, have actually occupied vacant land and said, we have a right to this land. If it's not being used, we can build schools and gardens on it just to survive. So I think that idea of the commons and kind of how we look at the common elements is something that, as Melissa mentioned, is worth looking at. And then just real briefly, that conversation of the nutritious foods and what we're eating is such a good point. And again, this is another topic that we address briefly in the book. And some of that has to do with how we advertise. So dating back into the 1970s, right, there's been studies that show how food corporations in particular targeted children and even would send people into grocery stores to observe interactions between parents and children and specifically look at when children started complaining, right, crying or whatever about wanting certain types of foods, closely examining in which cases did the child get their way, right? And then incorporating that into their marketing campaigns for those types of foods that they wanted to sell. And those were often the foods that were high in sugar, high in fats, right? So, I mean, we can see that even at the youngest age, this is a struggle between kind of people who are really trying to feed their families nutritious food, and then sometimes, corporations that are just looking for the bottom line, so to speak. So good pieces of information when we kind of try to tackle the holistic problem.
Because at the end of the day, when you think about like our current system of how we have businesses and all that stuff, there could be like an unhealthy capitalistic system and all that stuff. And sometimes it can also get into the politics of stuff. Because I remember like me and Shalise talked offhand about like how sometimes even with the fact of like food pantries and trying to, and I've helped out at food pantries in the past, and Melissa has probably some also experience in that with food banks and all that stuff, to where like it's good when there's nonprofits as well as churches or religious organizations that give back and give people the food, the homeless people out on the streets. But what about the local governments or the city governments actually doing something to help eradicate? And this is what we talked about, Shalise, eradicate the poverty rates to where homeless people are not under the bridges or not under the overpasses or something like that. Or randomly, sometimes in suburban neighborhoods, you see a homeless person like outside of a grocery store having like a sign up saying that, well, do this for food or anything like that, because it kind of shows like in some ways the fact that probably I'm assuming bureaucracy and the politics and all that stuff, and local city governments to where they're not trying to find tangible ways to help at least subside the poverty rates with like, access to food as well as housing and all that type of stuff, which can, I'm sure you probably address also in the book too as well.
I think one thing that you mentioned too is that role between, and this is a constant sort of political conversation, what role does the government play in protecting sort of basic human needs, right? And this is an ongoing consideration. And Larnell, as you mentioned, right, is quite often when our food banks and our pantries are distributing food as it kind of trickles down, it is nonprofit organizations, religious institutions that are quite often on the front lines of distributing that food. And so that's essential to the delivery of that emergency food, as I mentioned in the very beginning. So that's great. We still need that. But again, that doesn't address those upstream problems. But what happens oftentimes that we've seen is in the process of kind of recognizing that complex sort of stream of flow of the goods, we lose sight of, well, okay, who's funded, right? How is, who's paying for the food banks, who's paying for those secondary distributors? When we get to the churches, how are the churches being funded? And that all gets kind of obfuscated or clouded by the fact that, in political conversations, we say, well, the government shouldn't be paying for this. It should be, in the hands of nonprofits, or it should be in the hands of private industry, or it should be in the hands of the churches, right? Sure, on an ideological level, that argument can be made, but when you're kind of boots on the ground sort of thing, right? I mean, these are real life problems. There's many churches, many nonprofits that say, yes, we're happy to help you out, but we also need to feed our own families. So it's not as simple as saying whether the government should or should not be participating in this. That's on one level. I think from a food sovereignty perspective, looking at the big picture, we say we all benefit from having a healthier society. We all benefit when we don't have an unhealthy society. We all pay when our levels of heart disease and type 2 diabetes skyrocket, right? And so to that extent, we need to all be chipping in to find that solution to that too. So it's not just kind of this group is food insecure for these reasons or unhealthy for this reason, and therefore they should pay for it. It's an entire society problem, and we all should be chipping in.
because it trickles down not only in the hospitals, but the criminal justice system, even. It trickles down to the environmental factors and even, like the Department of Children and Family. It trickles down to all of these different like aspects of society, like you said.
Yeah, Shalise, I love that you mentioned that because this is one of my sort of passions for looking at these issues through the lens of food is it's not just food. When we start to dig deeper and look at the problems of why we have a food or food insecure populations and country itself, we start to see that those same sort of issues arise in the criminal justice system, in the education system, in housing, things of that nature. And in the same sense that we recognize that the problems can only be solved by looking at the root causes of those problems, as we do with food sovereignty, you can apply those same principles to eliminating, incarceration rates, to eliminating, broader social issues like racism, to reforming, education systems so it's more equitable to people, and the list sort of goes on.
I have two very silly examples, but I don't know, it's just where my brain goes. But I'm thinking, in the movie in Aladdin, when he steals the bread and then everyone's after him because they want to arrest him and he's like, I'm hungry, like I'm not trying to, I'm not trying to cause trouble. I'm not trying to whatever. I'm hungry. And it's a very silly example, but, touching on what Shalise said, like with a criminal, like a lot of times we see crime because people are trying to satisfy their basic needs, and unfortunately, especially right now, it's a big news that food costs are through the roof right now. I feel like there's the priorities are very out of order right now because it's like before we do all these, over the top things and, we're trying to do this, that, and the other thing. Like, I think that the priority should be making sure that everyone's basic needs are met, safety and food and things like that. And then the other thing that I was thinking as we were talking about this, like, having access to food. I don't know why I think in cartoons, but in the Lorax, it's the teacher in me. It's the teacher in me. In the Lorax, they got rid of all the trees, and then they're selling air. They're making air cost money to people, and it's again a silly example, but it's such a correlation to what and to exactly what we're talking about, with food. Like, this is a basic need. This shouldn't be something that people have to worry about or, anything like that. And I kind of always have this in my circle of friends, this running joke that, if I ever won the lottery, I would go around the area and buy up all the, we have like 20 by 20 plots of land with for sale signs on them. And I'm like, what do we possibly need to build on this patch of 10 trees? Do we need another car wash? Do we need another self-storage facility? And I always have just wanted to purchase those plots of land and then just let them sit there and let them be and have trees. But I think, what you were saying sort of inspired me. I'm like, oh, if that ever does happen, I would buy them and then maybe plant a whole bunch of, produce and fruit trees and things like that. And then just have just these places that if anyone needs, they can just go, like a little food forest. But that's ideal. It's ideal thinking, but getting back to everything has a dollar sign and a cost. Now it's like you'd have to pay to plant it and pay for whatever else you need. And it seems like it's such a vicious cycle.
It is a cycle indeed. And that's what makes it so hard to really address, because it's not just one way to address it. It's really a huge systemic problem that doesn't really have one answer to it.
And really, like, and before I get back to Will, like, really speak on the thing, like, even with crime, I remember, like, one of, like, here on the show, one of our past guests, Chris Lamarck, who does this nonprofit organization called Coffee, Hip Hop, and Mental Health, was saying how, like, poverty is violent, and sometimes having poverty can lead to crime based on the economics, because, again, like, it's more than just, some people can be just evil and do terrible things, or sometimes just be racist. But then other times it's more because of the economics. And going back to what Melissa was saying in the movie Aladdin, it's just because, they have to go rob a convenience store because otherwise than that, they don't have enough money to actually get the proper food that they need and all that stuff. So they feel like, well, the only way to do it is to resort to stealing rather than trying to figure out how can I get the money and all that stuff, you know? So it's all these type of things because it shows like in some ways economic despair and mental instability. You know, now, look, I'm not a psychologist, though. I'm interested in psychology stuff, but it's like there can also be a psychosis and psychology within those things when the economics are down, and even when there's not access to good food as much as good housing, as well as like good payments and all that stuff. And yet we have some of these politicians, which me and Celeste also talked about offhand, about some people, not to get too political, but some people want to end SNAP programs and all that stuff, which is like basically it's like the WIC. It's like in terms of like food programs by the government to where it helps them be able to get food in the stores, but they feel like, going back to your point, Will, in terms of how some feel like, well, like the government should not be involved, but not really recognizing that there's certain times where the government should be involved, because if we're a government by the people for the people, shouldn't for those type of important issues, as much as like nonprofits are good and religious institutions are good to like give back, it's like we sometimes need the government to be able to step in and say, hey, we got to take care of our people that are our citizens.
That's great, Lionel. And let me mention just one point that I make this in my first book, the Politics of Food, the Global Conflict Between Food Security and Food Sovereignty. I didn't realize when I was writing that book that it ended up being sort of my intended audience, so to speak, ended up being almost political in nature, but in a surprising way. It ended up being an argument that allowed us to have a conversation that crossed the aisle. So my specific example is, my point is oftentimes communities, in that sense, I was talking about global communities that were just asking these huge multilateral organizations like the United Nations, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, as well as trade arrangements enshrined in the World Trade Organization, to simply stop interfering with their, macroeconomic policies, their agricultural policies, right? So in a certain sense, it was making that kind of argument of like, we don't want any government involved in this, right? So that does specifically apply to kind of one political side that says, hey, the government shouldn't be involved. And let me, kind of translate that to a sort of a real life example here in Florida. One of the debates that we had in St. Pete, but also in Tampa, for example, is ordinances that didn't allow people to grow food in their front yards, right? These ordinances were recently sort of passed where, okay, we eliminated those barriers. People in some cases can grow their own food now, but this would be kind of a common ground between, across the aisles, right? So now you're just simply saying, yes, we don't want the government involved, right? We want the freedom to grow our own food. So it appeases one side that says, hey, we want to be able to just grow healthy food. If we don't have access to it, at least allow us to grow it. So we're not asking for government help. We're just asking for the government to stop enacting policies that are preventing us from doing what we just want to do, i.e. feed our families. Now, I want to be careful with that, because that can lead to a slippery slope that says, okay, everyone should just grow their own food then. That is not the case, right? Or that's not what I think the solution is. I still agree, as many of you have pointed out, that there still needs to be government involvement, but it's not out of some sort of moralistic, like the government should do this to help. But the fact that, well, maybe it is a little bit, but I think you can also make the argument that our basic survival depends on this. We are also interconnected, that if we are not contributing altogether to solutions to the problem, then we won't find any solutions to it. So it's almost a duty, a citizenship duty, that we, ensure that our communities are food secure. So yeah, really, really interesting kind of ways in which we can, I hope I never lose my idealism, but in those moments where we do lose that idealism, it's okay to try to also be creative in finding solutions like this that might say, look, all right, here's an idea, one small idea, but at least it crosses the political aisles.
I think very simply, it just to me, this is a thing that we almost like have to step back, or not step back, but maybe shift lenses, instead of looking at it from a political perspective, look at it from a human perspective, like we're humans first, so how do we look at this from, a perspective that's going to be, most, first of all, tangible for people, and that's going to be effective, and then we can maybe switch back to their lens and say, okay, within, our policies, within whatever, how can we translate this now so that we're really touching on the issue that needs to be touched on. And I just had this thought, when you're saying, because we had that here for a while too, people weren't allowed to, plant produce and things in the front, which we have it now. We have a lot of fleet farming in my area. But it's just wild to me. I don't know, maybe because I'm such a nature girl, but it's just wild to me that someone, you can't plant a cucumber in your front yard. Like, like that's to me, and not even just because you're telling someone they can't do that, which that's to me, I don't know. It's absurd, but but also just, I don't know.
Well, Melissa, I think you're right. And I think you can make the argument, or at least what I do in my first book, but also in subsequent writings, that if you think that food is a human right, then that is an infringement of your human right to say that you are not allowed to grow your own food. And that argument that I've made has caused some pushback, and people say, well, wait a second, that's a little too extreme. But if you do, base your kind of ideological, moral, whatever you want to call it, perspective on the idea that we all have a human right to food, then anything that prevents you, barring harming others, which you're not when you're growing it on your own property, anything that bars you from doing that is a violation of human rights.
It absolutely is. Like the idea that, zoning laws and, city ordinances prevent you from being able to grow your own food, that's just absurd. I can't, I don't understand it.
I think it goes back to the, what are our priorities? Are we really going to worry about, this person planting an orange tree? Or are we going to worry about things that are really having a detrimental effect on our population?
And it just goes to show we're not focused on the right things. So we're focused on, in that way, they're trying to control what people eat, right? By telling you that you can't grow your own food, they're controlling what you can eat and what you can have access to. But then in the same breath, they don't want to take that control and make sure you have access to quality food, which it's like they're using that control for the wrong reasons.
Even going back to a little bit of politics, it's like the equivalent of how like they would not have kids to have like free healthy meals in the public schools or anything, So they want to cut those programs in order to just basically, do it on bureaucratic or political wins or something like that, and it's just, what about the nurturing of our kids though? I'm not trying to say like just have the kids only be vegan or something like that. I'm just trying to also say that, have them have options when they're trying to eat in the schools and all that stuff, because it's just, when it comes to that, it probably speaks back to food sovereignty or food insecurity. When kids have access to food when they're going to public school, you want to make sure that, there's enough there instead of more of like just not allowing free healthy meals and all that stuff. Now, certain states have done this. So certain states have been allowed that, but then there's some other states, unfortunately, certain red states, they have not allowed this and all that stuff. And that's a problem right there and all that stuff, because sometimes, like even going to Melissa's point, we got to take the politics out and focus on what's best for the kids as well as what's best for like people in society as a whole and all that stuff, to where it doesn't seem like we have to always politicize food and healthy meals.
That's a great point, Larnell. And this is something back to our kind of looking at historical roots of this problem. This was something back in the 1960s, and the impetus for the Black Panther Party's free breakfast program. They said, and so we have we have all the kind of the vilification of the Black Panther Party. But if we look at the specific food related issue, Black communities were saying, nobody is giving us, our children, food. Nobody is allowing us to, access to food. Our inner cities are crumbling. And so we're just going to take matters into we're going to try to protect our own children. We're going to feed our own children. So it was kind of a precursor to some of our modern kind of community garden and growing your own food types of movements. But in this case, in those urban areas that really had zero green spaces, right? The community just coming together and say, if nobody's going to help us, we're going to help, ourselves. And so that's really, I think, one of the origins, again, kind of looking at root causes, but also root solutions, to communities kind of taking control when they say, hey, government, you've failed us completely, we're going to do it on our own.
And really, like, I remember seeing the documentary about the Black Panthers and how they helped with the free breakfast program, because that's something that was so interesting. Because in the past, like when I was younger, I had such a certain idea about the Black Panthers, but then when I learned about that, it's like, oh, they're trying to help their Black communities, because also they dealt with the issue of sickle cell and really building hospitals, because like Chairman Fred Hampton wanted to build hospitals in the communities and all stuff. Because sometimes when people only chastise the militancy and all this other types of stuff, they're not really seeing the good that really the Black Panthers have done for their communities. If you only understand the generalistic type of thing, or if you hear things from a certain political side, then it's like, you're not really hearing their story and their words and really from their perspective and all that stuff to understand, okay, why did they make the free breakfast program right there? Because so many times it seemed like local governments, as well as the government itself, even going back to the 60s, like, I'm not trying to get into a full conversation about this, but it's like, certain parts were already against the Black community amidst everything else and all that stuff, so that's why, again, when it comes to caring about communities, it's also having the mutual aid idea about knowing what their needs are and all that stuff. Again, it goes back to what I said earlier. It's not just about having community gardens and farmers markets, which is all good. I'm not against that, but it's also about having businesses to be able to have a healthier option in those communities to say, we're going to create this. Now, some communities have done that, but there should be more of that going on. And even from the major chains, I'm going to just say that from the major chains, hey, you got some customers in these areas too as well and all that stuff, that you might need their buyers' money from and all that stuff.
Right.
Just saying.
I think we've kind of touched upon this in tangential ways, but your point about sort of financial literacy, business development, entrepreneurship around the food space is something that I think is really, it's incredibly lost on us right now, especially in food insecure communities. So if you want to be very cutthroat about it, as you mentioned, Larnell, I mean, we fail to realize how much economic potential is in communities, right? Whether it's purchasing power or even, what I would like to concentrate on, the more positive side of just the ingenuity and the assets that, communities of color can bring to the conversation and can bring to the table. For example, just purely from a business perspective, it's baffling that people don't recognize this. But then on a more humane level, kind of this is we're all human beings. I do think that when we have limited resources, this is where things like community gardens can come in handy in terms of sort of teaching us some of those basic strategies in financial literacy, small scale kind of entrepreneurial activities that can really help children out too, just to kind of learn the nuts and bolts. But they're doing it via a means that is producing food and healthy food too. So there's all kinds of ways you can be entrepreneurial, but if we, really bolster those programs that are entrepreneurial in the food space too, that's an extra bonus, because now we're also kind of, our projects are healthy in their very nature too. So I do see that as one kind of positive, a glimmer of hope that we can find in sort of our community garden programs that we have, for example.
Anyway, folks, you can get Will's book entitled Food Insecurity, a Reference Handbook. Definitely check it out. You can get it on Amazon, and what other places can you get the book?
You can get it from Amazon or Bloomsbury Academic from the publisher's website as well.
And Will, we thank you so much for coming back on the show and really just having this good conversation with us, this good discussion with us about food insecurity. And I hope people can get something out of it.
Well, thank you so much. I really enjoyed Shalise and Melissa and Larnell. Obviously, whenever I see and talk with you, it's a pleasure, but it was great meeting you two both. And yeah, continue doing. I think this is a fantastic podcast. And I think not only is it interesting, but it's a thing that this society needs, this world needs. So I encourage you to keep it up, and I look forward to listening myself.
Oh, thank you so much.
This was a great conversation.
Well, thanks for all the work that you're doing on this and for sort of leading the way for us. And this was a great conversation. So thank you.
Well, I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Autistic Delicatessen. Remember, you can like and subscribe to us via YouTube by looking for us with the Autistic Delicatessen. And also, too, you can find us on Spotify. And also follow us on Instagram at instagram.com/the Autistic Delicatessen. And also you can check us out on the ampliverse.com/the-autistic-delicatessen, as well as the autisticdelicatessen.card.co.
You can check me out at Autistic Travel Goddess on Instagram, Neurodivergent Millionaire on YouTube, and Autistic Millionaire on TikTok.
And you can find me on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and YouTube at Sweet Melissa Cooks.
And also make sure you check out Nico at Food on the Spectrum, as well as Orlando Foodie Fest for his, if you're in the Orlando area, for his food events. So until next time,
What's on your plate is how we relate.